Hello, everyone. My name is Beatrice Jona Affron. I am the Louise and Alan Reed Music Director at Philadelphia Ballet. On behalf of the Ruth and A. Morris Williams Jr. Artistic Director, Angel Correa, the Dr. Carolyn Newsom Executive Director, Shelley Power, along with the board, emeritus trustees, artists, and staff, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the supporters who have made possible not only tonight's webinar, but also our production of Swan Lake. Alan R. and Judy Brick Friedman, who are supporting this particular event, thank you so much. The Honorable Joyce Keene and Herbert Keene, MD, and Nestor Llorente and Don Jones, thank you all. I'd like to let everyone on Zoom know that this is being recorded. We will invite our Zoom participants to submit questions via chat for a Q&A at the end. I'm so happy to introduce our very distinguished panel of experts. I will start to my extreme right with Professor Simon Morrison, who has traveled down from Princeton to be with us. Dr. Morrison is an archival historian specializing in 20th century Russian and Soviet music, with expertise in opera, dance, film, and historically informed performance. He is a leading expert on the music of Sergei Prokofiev. We're going to have to talk to you again next year, by the way, Simon. And has just published this fascinating and much needed book, Tchaikovsky's Empire, with Yale University Press. Dr. Morrison is actively engaged in ballet, and he has translated his archival findings into new productions. In 2005, he oversaw the recreation of the Prokofiev ballet Le Pas d'Acier at Princeton University. I am extremely sorry to have missed that. Next, we have rehearsal director Charles Askegard. Charles is something of a unicorn in the dance world. He joined American Ballet Theater in 1987 under the direction of Mikhail Bershtikov, and danced with the company for 10 years. Then in 1997, Charles migrated to New York City Ballet, where he spent 14 years as a principal dancer. And this means that he brings to our company vast knowledge and experience with the two artistic rivers that feed the American dance world. In addition to coaching our dancers, Charles often performs on stage in roles such as Herr Drosselmeyer and Don Quixote, one of my favorite Charles roles. This spring, he will take on a new role. Charles will choreograph a work to be premiered at our spring fundraiser at Red Rose Farm, and we are all very much looking forward to that. Next, we have the fabulous Sydney Dolan. Sydney joined Philadelphia Ballet's second company in 2016, and a year later, she joined the main company as an apprentice. She was promoted to the Corps de Ballet in 2018-2019, and then to soloist during the 2019-2020 season. However, in 2018, Sydney received the prestigious Ballet Fellowship from the Princess Grace Foundation. Very prestigious. And about a year ago, following a performance as the Siren in The Prodigal Son, I was so proud to be on stage in that moment, or looking up at Sydney in that moment. Sydney was promoted to principal dancer. Sydney first danced the role of Odette Odile when we performed Swan Lake in 2021. And last but not least, I am so happy to welcome wardrobe manager Jennifer Tierney. Jennifer danced professionally with companies such as Ballet West and Milwaukee Ballet, and so she brings a deep understanding of costuming for dance. She has designed several full-length ballets and is currently in charge of building costumes for our upcoming premiere of Angel Correa's Bolero, as well as exciting world premieres that our Philadelphia audiences will see next year. More to come. So I'm just going to set the scene a little bit about, why are we here and what is it that continues to fascinate us about Swan Lake? For many of us, Swan Lake is the ballet of ballets. I think if I were to stop someone in the street and ask them to demonstrate a ballet step, they might very well do this. And that comes from Swan Lake. It doesn't come from somewhere else. Swan Lake is a staple of the repertoire. It is a work that sustains ballet companies economically too, second only to the Nutcracker. By my count, and I've probably missed a few, Swan Lake will be performed in the U.S. this season alone by ABT, Boston Ballet, New York City Ballet, Oklahoma City Ballet, where I've just been, and Philadelphia Ballet. It might come as a surprise to some of our viewers to learn, therefore, that when the ballet was premiered in Moscow in 1877, it was considered a failure by dancers, critics, and audiences. So I'm going to turn to Simon and ask, first of all, can you tell us something about how Tchaikovsky came to receive this, which is his very first ballet commission, his very first ballet at all, and about its very disappointing premiere? Why was it so disliked?
Well, first, thank you. It's great to be with wonderful artists for this talk. That was a question that nobody knew the answer to until several years ago. And that great sin bin in Moscow, known as the Bolshoi Theater, underwent a big renovation. And they brought in soldiers to clear out papers they found in the attic in the basement, and brought it over to the administrative complex. And there they found the parts and the original score of this work. And that allowed, after a lot of sleuthing and detective work involving many different archives, to piece together what happened back in 1877 and 1875 when Tchaikovsky wrote the music. He was a young composer. He had done a couple of operas and a couple of symphonies. He didn't know anything about dance besides goofing around with kids, his sister's kids. And when he received the commission, he took it because he needed the money. Writing music for ballet was not prestigious. And so people like Cesare Pugni and Minkus were in-house composers, and they were not, in the snob realm of classical music considered to be top talents. But Tchaikovsky needed the money at this period in time, and he took on the commission owing to the fact that a friend of his named Vladimir Begachev was what was called the sort of repertoire inspector. Basically, he was the program director inside the Bolshoi, and he was also a literary person, and he wrote up the scenario we now know for the original Swan Lake. And he asked Tchaikovsky to do the music. Tchaikovsky needed the money. It was like a 700 ruble commission, which was respectable, but not much more than he got teaching for a year. And he didn't know how to model the score, and so he borrowed from the library various other scores of ballets that we no longer have, mostly because he took the scores home and didn't return them to the library, including a ballet called The Fern and various other things. And we think he probably modeled some stuff on those. He put together the score, a very symphonic score that dancer after dancer after dancer at that period rejected because it seemed, undansant. It wasn't about, the phrase lengths were wrong. There were too many confusing rhythms and so forth. The plot was very different. The idea of having this human world and then this swan world intersect, it was far more complicated. The opening act was busier, and what was put on stage was choreographed by a fellow who came from a family of circus performers named Wenzel Reisinger. And this person was, at this period in time, the Bolshoi Ballet was, threadbare, and various talents came through, and he received this person came from the Czech-speaking lands to choreograph the Bolshoi for a couple of years. He was good with the corps de ballet. He didn't know much about how to handle soloists, so he borrowed and recycled dances from other shows, including a Jules Verne ballet, Around the World in 80 Days, and so on and so forth. So when you look at the original score, you see here is 80 days, and it's a mess of stuff, but musically it kind of makes more sense than the version that became famous, because he actually was thinking about the original plot, which was very different. And so famous numbers that end up in the seduction scene of the third act and the wedding scene, a lot of that music was in the first act, and stuff got rearranged. Anyway, it was premiered. It hung on for a few years. Reisinger passed on the choreography to another choreographer named Joseph Hansen. Tchaikovsky's patroness wrote to him and said, this show looks terrible. The critics at the time couldn't believe it because Bolshoi was not electric wired this period in time, but they had batteries for special effects, and one was a red light to illuminate a deal. And these batteries made a lot of noise, and there were complaints about the whole thing sounded like artillery fire, and the ending was drowned out. It was just a big mess. And that, the audiences in Moscow were okay with this sort of messy vaudeville show, but that's what they got. And the reviews were. And Tchaikovsky then heard a Delibes ballet called Sylvain. He's like, oh God, mine is terrible. Anyway, But then he became eminent as an imperial composer, and he received a commission to work directly with Marius Petipa on Sleeping Beauty, and at the end of his life, The Nutcracker. And then when he died of cholera in 1893 as a memoriam project, Petipa said to his disciple, Le Vivant, he said, what was that first ballet he did that was a flop?
Yeah, there we
Yeah.
go. I wanted to be sure
Yeah.
that we could see this. Can you just tell us a little bit?
Yeah,
about
so this is the original design for this is the scene of encounter. Obviously, you see Benno there and Siegfried at the front, and you see the swans coming out, Dead and her girlfriends. There's the Lake of Tears behind here. It's the lake shed by the mother about the death of her
wasn't
stepmother.
it real water back there?
No, this was
Because
there was what they did at the end, though. What the routine, what you did for floods is this is a great story, is you would bring in kids from the street in Moscow, and there were a lot of urchins and so forth, and these kids, and they'd have them writhe underneath tarps, so to create a sense of waves and so forth. But they did use electricity at the end for these fans to kind of create a sense of a windstorm, which also created a lot of noise. The Bolshoi was in such impoverishment at this period in time that this is actually a set from an opera, William Tell, by Rossini, which was being performed, and they just recycled it. And sometimes they bring the sets down on the train from St. Petersburg because that theater had more money. So this was the designs. They were published ahead of the production. Likewise, the scenario was, so people knew what they were getting into when they see the show. So this was it. And anyway, he died, and then Petipa created the masterpiece.
So I was going to ask you, if I can. So like most modern versions, right? Angel's Swan Lake is based on the 1895 revival that you mentioned by the great Marius Petipa, who was ballet master at the Imperial Ballet in St. Petersburg he had a hugely long career, 1858 to 1904, and was extremely old when he died.
And sad to retire in his 80s.
And sad
he's
to retire.
He's really like, I still have a lot to go.
At like 88.
Bitter at 84 retiring.
And we can thank Petipa for most of the modern productions of a very large chunk of our canon, right? So Corsair by Adair, Sleeping Beauty,
Quixote.
Just to name a few. So can you just review a little bit some of the changes, and I call them improvements, that Petipa made to the libretto and therefore to the score to transform this into like a big hit?
Yeah, he was obviously a great dramaturg, and he knew how to work with great dancers, and the great dancers could tell him what to do, and he would abide their requests. So he slimmed down the plot, simplified it, streamlined it, so you have this binary in place. He wanted a showcase for the seduction scene of Odette deceiving Siegfried into thinking she's the true beloved, Adele deceiving Siegfried into thinking she's Odette, and so forth, the true beloved. So he wanted more music for that, repurposed music from the first act for that. The music for the famous 32 Fouettes is actually the coda to the first act of the ballet. And if you actually you can imagine it's like the coda to actually a drinking party. And so you can imagine people swirling around with the kerchiefs in the air. That was the coda to Act One, and made some musical sense. But he wanted this bravura section for this Italian ballerina who had come to St. Petersburg, like Nani Perina, and she said that it was her house specialty to do this particular very difficult step. And so he put the music in there for that. The other problem he had was actually with the original reviews, they thought that the ballet was relentlessly bleak. I mean, it was just absolute. I mean, the ending was apocalyptic. There was no glimmer of light. There was no sense of any sort of apotheosis of love being eternal, etc. And one of the things that Petipa wanted to do was brighten up the music. So he asked Ricardo Drigo, who was the in-house composer at that time up at the Mariinsky Theater, to take the score and busy it up. So a lot of the cymbals, the big brassy sounds, the cannonades, etc., that's his addition to the score. So the original one was a bit more serene, had a darker coloring throughout because it was heavily string-based. And so it got refocused and turned into something that, like Arlene Croce and others complained about. There's odd sort of sounds that kind of crash into the middle of the action that don't seem to belong there. So it's an oddity in the sense that for music people, I've heard the original version now. I went to the Bolshoi when they unearthed it, and it was done on violins. It's the violin rehearsal score we have, and it makes a lot more musical sense. but it doesn't make sense for the plot that Petipa came up with. So it needed to be changed. It was rearranged in all sorts of ways. There was nipping and tucking and cuts and some repetitions added, and then this kind of inflation of the score with brass and percussion that Drigo did. There was no Black Swan for the original version in 1895 that Petipa did. That's a 20th century edition. It was actually a slimmer version that actually has gotten performed over time that they did. It was a sort of memorial concert and then production for Tchaikovsky. Those things were added as the work gained more integrity in the early 20th century. The last thing I'll say is when you think about a lot of 19th century ballets, there's a huge number of them disappeared, including some that seemed to have been really great. And one of the questions is always like, why did certain ballets survive and others not? And the theory in Russia was that they didn't have this system of schools. It was like an apprentice system, right? So you studied with the great dancers who knew the roles and they passed them down. And because of the gap with Swan Lake, there was nobody who knew the originals, obviously. But there was a shift in thinking at the Imperial theaters where they decided to actually look at the repertoire and those ballets that, irrespective of the star dancers, had some sort of conceptual heft, some ideas that were interesting, about fate and deceit and love, etc., this world, the other. Those they would hang on to. And Swan Lake was picked. And so it survived in part because of this change in the way. So you'd have a lot of kind of nonsensical fun works that survived simply because we had a great dancer who loved the role, like Satanella, which was a huge hit and disappeared. But this one seems to have survived because of some of the ideas within it.
Thank you. Charles, I take it you danced Swan Lake with both companies, right? With ABC
That's correct,
and New York
yes.
City Ballet. And so I would love to know, how were those experiences? I know the choreography was certainly different, but how was the experience also of dancing them different for you?
Oh boy. When I was with American Ballet Theater, there's this long tradition of that was really one of the defining ballets of American Ballet Theater was Swan Lake, and so I felt an immense pressure to live up to that, and when I got the opportunity to perform it, I just loved it. I had worked on it for a couple of years before I had given the opportunity to perform it, and it was quite a long version. It was nearly 3 hours in length, and so it was a real it was just a real beast of a ballet. It was big, it was long, and it was difficult. And then when I went to the New York City Ballet, I got the opportunity to perform the Balanchine version, which was about a 35-40 minute ballet, and it had music from all different acts. And Mr. B had created a story that was the story of Swan Lake, but it was like a mini full length in about 35 minutes. And then Peter Martins, I think it was in 1999, he did a brand new version of full length version of Swan Lake, and it was both traditional, but then also had a lot of the Balanchine aspects to it as well. And to me, it was like while it was dancing something very familiar, it was dancing something very new as well. And so I really enjoyed that, both of those ways of the interpretation of the Prince. And Prince Siegfried was one of the roles that I danced. Like when I look at my career, and I danced probably that role the most out of all the full lengths that I performed, and whether it was with American Ballet Theater, New York City Ballet, or other companies that I would guest with, and I loved that ballet. And it was also one of those things that I also kind of feared, and because it's very, very difficult. It is called Swan Lake, but the Prince is on all 4 acts.
True enough.
And so it's the pas de deux are hard, the dancing is hard, the acting is difficult, and it's just one of those ballets that really is both for the female ballerina and the male dancer it's like one of it's like the penultimate role.
So now that you're in the position of teaching it, I'm interested to know, and I think our audience generally likes to know a lot about process. So what I'm curious about, among the many things, is what is it like to teach this ballet to someone who's never danced it before, say the role of Odette Odile, versus what it's like to coach the role with someone who has done it before?
Right. Okay. So when you're first starting out coaching or teaching a role, you really the way that I like to do it anyway is I like to give the steps along with the story and the start of the style, right? So that the dancer understands, because if you overload too much, you don't go anywhere, and you just you're doing half the steps and then never going on. And so I like to have all of the idea with the idea of the style and the character, but it's not totally fleshed out once it's been learned. Once it's learned, once the steps are learned, then we start working with the patadas and making them all smooth. And then through all of this process, the character starts, they understand the steps. The character starts to unfold along with some guidance, and then you get some of the character, and then also the movement, the upper body quality, the arms, and then for the prince, for his part, how does he partner her? How does he look at her? How does he position his body? So these are all, and then there's some very, very technical things. How does he partner her? How, is your leg stretched here? It should be an attitude. No, you're in tendu here. No, then this pirouette comes down, and make sure you're turned out here, and all these very, very technical things, but they're all very important. And then the other thing is that, when a young dancer has that opportunity, they want to do everything right away. It's like, I want to do it, and then usually you end up going, oh, wait, let's just slow down, because we've got to get all of it. And actually, Beatrice, you saw a little bit of that today in rehearsal, and so with a young man in von Rothbard, so then you have to slow them down a little bit, just so that they can get into the movement and into the character and into what how they need to start working. So that's how those are the sort of beginning steps of how you do it with somebody who's never done it before. How you teach that. Now when you come back to a role like Sydney has this year, she's had that experience, and then you also did Black Swan at the gala in October, and so we've been kind of working on this a little bit all year, on and off. The Black Swan part anyway. And so I always liked coming back to a role, because you when you're a dancer, if you've danced something as important as Swan Lake, you remember each show, and you remember what you did a couple of years ago, how it went, and it was like, oh God, yeah, there was that one moment that wasn't so good, and you go, but that
with video, it's been recorded for
that's even worse.
All time.
Yeah. But so you get to come back and revisit it, and then you also get a whole new perspective on, like, that was how I'm doing it, how we did it, how we learned it. Now I'm coming in at a little different level, and now I can start at a higher level, and we can go a little bit more. We can go a little bit more places with the character, with the technique, with the partnering, with the relationship with the partner, and everything. And so it's just acquiring a different richness, a different depth of feeling, technique, nature, all kinds of things. And it's really great when you have a ballet like this, like Swan Lake, and you can come back to every few years and feel like you feel your own growth, and you want to do that more. So it's really interesting.
Well, you've provided a very smooth transition to my questions for Sydney. So in most productions, including ours, the principal ballerina dances two roles, the tragic Odette and her cruel avatar, Odile. I can't think of another ballet. Maybe there is one that makes a similar demand on a dancer, the double role thing. So my first question is, what are the unique challenges of dancing two roles in one evening?
The list goes on for days and days of how many challenges there are in Swan Lake for the ballerina. I feel like oftentimes if you were to go up to a ballerina and ask her what the hardest role she's ever danced, they would probably say Odette Odile, because of there's so many aspects of the technique, the artistry, the acting, the storytelling, but also the quality of becoming a different creature, a different species, and maintaining that the entire night. And all of that kind of rolled into one is kind of the perfect little package that Swan Lake is for the ballerina. And I think for me personally, coming back to it, I think the biggest challenge that I'm kind of dissecting a little more this time is the Odette. That's a little bit more challenging for me personally, because you have pantomime and storytelling, but you also have to have that storytelling within your dancing and your movements and becoming a bird and never stop moving your upper body and always showing pain the whole time. And I think sometimes it's easy when you're performing something so technical such as Swan Lake, specifically in the second act. You're doing like almost a 9-minute pas de deux. It's very slow, very controlled, and you want to be as placed and strong as possible. But you have to have this element of fluidity and abandon and this pain, but you also have to have wings and you have to have a connection with your partner. And there's so much to it. So for me, a challenge is staying in that and never coming in and out of it, which is easy to do, especially we do our solo in the second act. And there's so many technically scary, very scary moments that you want to kind of tense up and you get in your head about it. And it's really difficult to kind of just let that go and allow yourself to just be as free as possible. Yeah.
So we're looking at a wonderful photo of you, actually not as Odile, as what we call big swans.
Big swans.
Not a great thing, but anyway, so that was even earlier in your career. So here's a very basic question that I've actually never asked a dancer, and I can't believe I never have, which is when you return to a role, how much of it does a dancer on average remember from production to production?
I think it depends on the ballet. Swan Lake specifically, I think most ballet dancers and ballet students are weaned. Like that's how we grow up, is with Swan Lake, the music. You learn the variation in variations class or pas de deux class. So I think that Swan Lake specifically is for me, and it's in my body, it's in my mind. Even before I did it, like watching so many videos. Now we have YouTube,
but it's also how many times we rehearse it.
Yes.
Because we rehearse this thing so much that it really gets into your body.
So when did Swan Lake rehearsals begin this time around? How many weeks will it have been by the time we get to the stage?
In January. When we came back, we started in January.
It's a lot of weeks leading up to the.
But somehow we never feel like
we never feel
like
ready.
It's enough time. Yeah, the last time, I think what also is different this time is when I premiered this part, we started rehearsals for it in October, I think, or November, and we were performing it at the same time in March. So we had a lot more time of preparation. Obviously, we were doing a lot of other ballets simultaneously, but this time it's a little bit more condensed. So the process is kind of, because many of us are revisiting the role, but it's also the process is a little bit quicker, so we're trying to get the steps in our bodies a little bit faster. Rehearsals have a little bit more of a faster pace. So
it's not the same, in other words, from time to time.
Yes.
Right.
It
always depends on what else is on the season calendar.
Exactly. Yes.
Jennifer, there are, not counting Odette Odile, there are 24 swans in our production of Swan Lake. That's a lot of tutus. Can you tell us something about the process of restoring all of those tutus? And we have a beautiful one sitting right here.
Definitely, right? The elephant in the room is our beautiful dress form and our swan in the room. So yes, there are 24 tutus, corps de ballet tutus. There are 2 Odettes and 2 Odiles. This year, we took on a very big restoration project. So I took all of the tutus out and realized that each one of them really needed their own bath. So, right? So in order to clean a tutu, you must very delicately place it in water and just let it essentially bathe. Drama, high drama for the tutu discussion. So I'm going to keep going, even without lights. So for this particular project, it's going to sound a little bit strange, but I got a kiddie pool and I let each tutu sit inside of the kiddie pool so that each layer of the tutu could be cleaned very thoroughly. And then what happens is the starch in the net starts to reactivate a little bit. So you drop it upside down. I don't know if we can see. Yeah, all the layers in the tutu. You hang the tutu upside down and you let it dry so that the starch resettles. So that was the first part of the process. And there were 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 of those to do, to simply just get them really nice and clean and white and pristine and ready for the massive amount of restoration that we did with the net. So typically there are 9 layers of net in a tutu, in a classical tutu, and we did a process that is called double hand pleating, which is very specific to tutu restoration, where you pleat the net, but then you also bend it back on itself. And what that does is it doubles the layer essentially, but it keeps it really, really flat. So there's a whole brand new layer inside of this tutu, giving it new life, new fluff. So they're almost ready to go. They've almost been connected and put back together and ready to go.
You can actually see the difference if you look at the photo and you look at this tutu here, you can see that those are hanging a little bit more.
It looks beautiful, Jennifer.
They are.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know when it
Absolutely
went up on the forum, up on stage, I got a little bit teary before we started, because it really is something where you're trying to find the most delicate balance. Of course, you want it to be clean, but this shape for a classical tutu has kind of the water lake effect. You do not want it sticking straight out from the hip. That is actually classified as a different tutu. It could be called a pancake tutu or a platter tutu. So this classical tutu and the style of the ballet really goes more towards a bell-shaped tutu. And so we didn't want to lose that. We wanted to give them all new life without losing the initial aesthetic that was intended for the tutus.
So, Jennifer, how many people does it require to make the entire production ready for performance? When does that process begin? And you've already told us somewhat of what the process is, but I assume you've also been working on the men's costumes and tunics and so on. So it'd be great to hear something about those.
Sure. So the wardrobe team of Philadelphia Ballet has a core of 3 people, including myself. So there's a wardrobe assistant manager. His name is Mark Mariani. I also have Kirsten Galler, who is our shoe manager and our wardrobe coordinator. In addition to the 3 of us as the core, we will have between 3 and 4 stitchers. So it takes a good 7 people for us to work on not just Swan Lake, but the entire organization is doing projects at all times. And really, when we do multiple things at once, it strengthens everything it is that we're doing, because we have a really talented stitcher. His name is Elmo, and he has been with the organization for a very long time. And he has been working on these tutus pretty much single-handedly, putting them together for us. But he's a wealth of knowledge. So he can be working on these tutus, but then also working on everything else that's happening in the shop. So it seems, I don't know, does 7 seem like a lot of people or not enough people? I always feel like I need more people.
Seems like the right amount.
I think it does seem like the right amount. 7, it's prime. Yeah. So, we are back there working on anything and everything all at once. Anyone who's visited the ballet, if you come back into wardrobe, I think it's a pretty happening place. It's
My favorite room in the building.
technicians and artists in a completely different way than the dancers, and visually very stimulating.
Thank you. So I thought I might bookend Simon's remarks a little bit and talk about what it's like to prepare the orchestral materials for Swan Lake. So as of just last week, I've now conducted 6 different productions of Swan Lake, but I bet you've danced more productions than I've conducted. Charles, is that possible?
Probably.
Probably, yeah. It's not a race. It's fine.
No, it's
fine.
not a competition.
competition. I've done Balanchine's Act 2, Christopher Wheeldon's Swan Lake for Pennsylvania Ballet, Alexei Retmansky's Swan Lake, which harkens back in some ways to the original production in 1877. And these are all different from each other, all of these Swan Lakes. Of course, they have a lot in common, but they are all different. The tempos are often seriously different, so that if I come from one production of, as I'm doing now, from one production of Swan Lake to another, I have to be a little careful and sort of reorient myself to the production at hand and be careful not to conduct the wrong tempo and do something that might endanger a dancer. These are the things that worry me. We were talking before about things that worry us, and that's something that I think it's definitely in my wheelhouse of worries. I've edited the orchestral materials now for 3 productions from scratch, and it's a big project, just like tutus. It's an enormous project. If we were to perform Swan Lake as written, as printed to this day, it would last, upwards of 3 hours, perhaps more. The Black Swan variation is still printed at the end of Act 1. So you have to excise it and put it in the middle of Act 3, which you have to do for at least 50 books. There are, that many musicians in the pit. And what became Balanchine's Tchaikovsky pas de deux has to be excised entirely, right? That's not included in Swan Lake. Lots and lots of cuts are put in, and lots of repeats are either taken out or put in. There are interpolated endings, like Sydney just found out, as many of you will, that actually the end of the White Swan pas de deux, the very end of it, of the Adagio section, was not composed by Tchaikovsky at all. It's an interpolation, as is true with Black Swan, also Adagio. And this creates a lot of paper and a lot of work and a lot of editing. To say nothing of the music that is sometimes put in to sort of cover up scene changes, because we have to get from the castle to the lake. And then if there's only one intermission, we have to get from the ballroom back to the lake. So it's a remarkable thing to me that for something that seems so stable, like Swan Lake, that has survived for so long and that we all think we know, actually every version is either somewhat different or a lot different from the next one. And that brings me to a question that I have for all of you. And some of you have touched on this, but I'd like to ask you all the same question, is that given all of this, all of the complications and sort of the trouble and what makes Swan Lake in the end such an enduring work? What is it? So if you don't mind, I'm going to start from Simon again and come down the line. You did allude to it a little bit before, but.
Well, I mean, you started off by actually saying that this is the ballet that people think of when they think about ballets. And one of the things that seems to be built into the score, besides, fate and, the nature of love and eternal love and love forfeited and bad family relationships, is actually this is a work that in the original version was about maturation, because you actually have these right, that scene, which is fine, and no one has ever messed with that one. But the original staging, going back to the costume things, there was gray swans, there were red ones, I don't know, from some else, other they were all different colors, but they were representing stages of life. And that I think disappeared. So what you're dealing with partly in this work is the fragility of that moment of first love and contact, and you have this terrible past, and you have this curse, and there's this something in your own moment that you can control for yourself, you think, that will actually give you happiness. And then there's this sort of traumatic, so there's ways in which this work has been interpreted for those reasons along all sorts of lines, romantic, obviously, these big themes, but, even psychological and psychoanalytic. You can run this plot through so many filters. And I think that's actually what I think led it to be actually preserved in the first place, but also you can find whatever you want within it.
Yeah, we actually haven't even touched on the many, many other versions. There's the Matthew Bourne version, and then the Trox have their own version, and it seems to be resilient. So yes, Charles, why do you think it's so resilient?
Music, story, and ballet technique.
But
The music is
the thing is that great theme, right? It's a chord. It's a minor chord, right?
That's correct.
B minor,
The scale, yep.
and it's like
Most of the time.
this is the challenge for the conductor, is like what he managed to do, and this is what puzzled the muse dancers at the start, was through the orchestration and the manipulation of color and the displacement of that tune through the registers. That's actually what gives it magic, because you look out into the surface and it's nothing. It's like the Nutcracker, a great pas de deux. It's a descending scale. How he can take those basic materials and just magicalize them.
But isn't also the beginning da 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 dee,
Glad you brought that up.
da, and that's just a little reversal of da 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 dee.
You got it. You're hired for the music department.
So you have these. It's just this setup of duality from the very beginning. And then you also have just the beautiful music of Tchaikovsky. Then the story, which has been over time, it has been changed and altered in a way that makes it a great classic tale. And then the ballet steps, the technique, has also evolved over time, and it's now one of the most demanding, of all ballets that you can dance, and so you have those magic elements that make this one of the most enduring works of ballet, period.
I see Swan Lake as a legacy. It's being Tchaikovsky's first ballet. I think that's in itself is just how long it's survived, and how many amazing dancers have danced it in the past and has come before us, and to get the chance to perform it and work on it and dive into it, and along with that too, how much of a work it is for the entire company. And like the corps de ballet of swans, there's nothing more beautiful than that. And the ending of the fourth act, when all the swans in unison just finish the act and they're the last ones on stage, there's something so, I have like chills. It's like, it's such, I just think it's such a legacy for all ballet dancers and musicians, and everyone, everybody walking on the street knows the music. And, I think it's one of those amazing legacies.
Mm-hmm. It's such good drama.
Yes, it is.
All
It's
of it.
juicy.
Right? The music is good drama. The costumes are good drama. The flapping of the wings. I think it's also really accessible. So one of my favorite aspects of costuming Swan Lake is you have the yin and the yang represented on stage. So you're not looking at it as an audience member who maybe doesn't know the story or go to the ballet very often and say, does the red guy not like the blue guy? It's accessible to people as their first ballet. If they go and they see it, all of the tutus on stage is so quintessential. You really feel like you've seen something, you've understood something, you were rooting for somebody, and you were caught up in the drama and the beauty of the ballet.
Before we go to questions, I do have one more thing that I'm sort of obsessed with, that I think about a lot because I conduct a lot of Tchaikovsky, which is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but none of Tchaikovsky's full-length ballets were successful during his lifetime. Am I right about that?
Sleeping Beauty was. That was a
People liked it.
Yeah, because it was a pull out all the stops production, which Petipa had control over this incredible budget. So that one was. Nutcracker was not. Owing to, it was, as noted when we were talking before, a double bill, and it didn't come off. And in fact, they had a lot of problems, actually. It seemed experimental for a lot of people, all pantomime first part and,
Right.
Understudies and then professionals in the sort of second half. And so it didn't come up, but Sleeping Beauty did. It was just synesthetic gorgeousness
But he did get some bad reviews, right? Even for Sleeping
Yeah,
Beauty.
yeah. But I mean, reviewers, the art of the review was actually in Russia. It was interesting. Criticism was what you were supposed to do. You were not supposed to praise. So everything was this kind of tutelage and instruction. Tchaikovsky was like, because he knew these people. And so the idea of like the invention of the review in Russia was about 1830s, and it was like, it was always kind of instructional, hectoring, and so you can't really tell. But people went to see the shows and they went to see the performers. Swan Lake had trouble because the dancer for which it was intended, Lydia Gaitan, it was a stunning, very, very young dancer. She said no way to this score. And then I went to Anna Sobeshanskaya, who was the prima ballerina assoluta, as they eventually called her. And she was in trouble to do with her patron getting into sort of financial embezzlement issues. And so I went to
Nothing changes.
Karpakova, who was not as strong as Sobeshanskaya. And so it was this weird sort of drama between Odette and Odile in real life kind of thing that actually informed the original production. So it was fraught.
So do you think when Tchaikovsky died in 1893, he knew that he had created the canon upon which all classical ballet companies base their repertoire?
No, he knew that Sleeping Beauty worked. He felt that he felt that his greatest opera was a disappointment, The Enchantress, which he thought was his great opera. That didn't stick. He knew that Eugene Onegin had been a massive success. And but he was very wealthy at the end. He earned the present day equivalent of about $350,000 a year. So he was okay. So he had this international success, but it was primarily just the accumulation of all that instrumental music and those concerti.
No, I'm not so much worried for Tchaikovsky, but I do marvel that he died really not understanding fully what he had given us.
He knew he'd changed opera. And his operas worked out a lot of problems in politics and social things in Russia, but not the ballets.
I wonder if we have some questions. Yes, we do. So there's a general question. What do the panelists think of Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake? Anybody want to address that? Sydney hasn't seen it.
I haven't seen it. Sorry.
I haven't seen the whole thing either. I've just seen the excerpts in Billy Elliot, so I can't speak to the whole thing.
Oh yeah. Then I have to.
Oh,
From
I love it when I mean it's a wonderful version of Swan Lake, and I think it's also very inspiring when somebody like Matthew Bourne takes on something like Swan Lake and gives it a real interesting perspective and something that you hadn't thought of before, and it's just quite it's a great experience. I think it's wonderful that but again, it goes back to this ballet. It's like it's so enthralling and so interesting that people come up with like Matthew Bourne, a great idea to have a new idea about Swan Lake.
What I will say is I love the naturalistic costume that the swan wears.
I was going to say, from a costuming perspective, it takes what is so traditional about Swan Lake and it somehow keeps it and turns it on its head. So it's very wild that the swans become just the bare-chested, and then all of the swan aspects are the lower body, where you'll see, her legs are out. So she's in the pink tights and the pink shoes, and for the Matthew Bourne version, it's reversed.
Okay, curious about the dance of the little swans, the pas de quatre. Was it part of the original or added afterwards by Petipa? Part of the original.
It was the first thing he composed, actually, because he actually improvised it at a kid's party. So he was visiting his sister and his kids, and they were doing little animal routines. So he came up with that. So that was the seeds for it.
So musically, it was part of the original, obviously. But I mean, it all was part of the original. But was it a pas de quatre?
Maybe the question is, was I want. So do we know, Simon, if the choreography that we see today of the Little Swans
That had
is
to be
similar
Petipa.
to that was Petipa, yeah,
1895.
yeah. And wasn't when he was creating that little ballet for his nieces and nephews, wasn't it like the little duck or the little? It had there was a waterfowl.
He did. They did a party where there were various, it was a lot of fowl and a lot of geese, ducks, various other things. He had them doing animals of a different sort. So he was playing around. The only ballet he knew when he got started on it was Giselle.
And he was it warms my heart to know that he was an admirer of Giselle and of
Well, he was an
Adolphe.
admirer of Adolphe Adam, but mostly because Adolphe Adam wrote a lot of great vaudevilles that he liked. So he had that side of it.
as well as Old Holy Night, by the way.
That was a whole night, right?
Sydney, what is your favorite variation or even moment to
Hawaii.
dance in the entire ballet? And then we'll talk about vacations another.
Oh, that's hard. I feel like both variations have their own demands. Both are, I think, equally stressful, and certain moments are enjoyable. I was working on Black Swan pas de deux for the gala this year, so I would say Black Swan is a little bit more comfortable and in my body this time around. So I guess I can enjoy it a little bit more. But some of my favorite moments in the ballet, I think, is the mime and kind of those in-between parts. I love doing the pas de deux and the variations and 32 poites and everything, but I really love the interaction with the prince and kind of that development of the story with him and trusting each other and falling in love. I really
that pas de deux is so
Yeah.
special. That
Yeah.
Talking
second
about
act
the
pas de
White
deux,
Swan.
the white
Yes,
swan.
the White
pas de deux.
Swan.
It's the most
where they
beautiful.
meet
yes,
and he almost shoots
music
her,
of that
but
is-
doesn't.
yes, no.
Right. So she's
But-
really fighting for her life.
Yes, and I feel like there's so many moments where there's this one moment where the prince is behind you and you're hugging and you just kind of you close your eyes and you just like rock back and forth, and there's something about that moment that obviously it's so peaceful, and it's like a moment of like calibration for your body. Like I can almost just rest, but it's also just like this moment where the music is like kind of at its peak, and it's amazing. And that, yeah, I love that whole second act sequence. I think it's kind of the pinnacle of the story.
How many people helped Sydney to change from the White Swan to black and vice versa? And isn't it the vice versa that's the more complicated?
It's quicker.
It's
It's quicker,
quicker,
right?
yeah. So luckily from second to third act, there's usually an intermission. So we'll have a little bit more time, but there's also, you have to change your headpiece, you have to change your tutu, and many of us like to change our point shoes because we need a harder shoe for Black Swan because you need something a little bit sturdier. White Swan is a little bit more lyrical. Headpiece, tutu. So usually we'll have a dresser who does our tutu.
Just one dresser helping in that moment?
One dresser is, and then if need be, if you need help with your headpiece, you can ask for assistance, but usually we like to do it ourselves, just picky wise. But going back into the White Swan for the fourth act is really quick. You exit after act 3, and then you have probably like maybe 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
And then you have to completely change your character.
Completely change your character, going from Odile to, and not only Odette, but even more
Distraught.
exaggerated, because you're not only in pain that you were before, but now your life, everything is just turned upside down.
So those 4 minutes are not meditative. Let me get
No.
into my next
No,
mood.
and by then you have done all the dancing in the ballet, so you literally are like, like but you have to go, because most of us were, by the time that music starts in the storm in the fourth act, when we change back into Odette for the final act, we run straight from our dressing room straight on stage. There's no time to spare. So it's a race.
What do we think of the various animated movies made based on Swan Lake, Swan Princess, and the Barbie adaptation? Were an important part of one viewer and maybe more than one viewer's childhood.
I was the Ken in the Barbie Swan Lake.
You were the Ken?
I was.
You are Ken.
Cracker.
I am
was-
Ken.
I did all the Barbie movies. I did Barbie's Nutcracker, Swan Lake, and the 12 Dancing Princesses.
Get out of town, really? That's
Motion
amazing.
capture. Yeah.
Were you at ABT at the time?
No, City Ballet.
We're at City Ballet.
Mhm.
Well, that's an amazing
So I love them.
reveal.
Yeah.
But I do have to say that Barbie Swan Lake was my favorite movie. Like that's how I kind of got familiar with a lot of the music. Not only the famous parts, you're walking around in the grocery store, you're watching TV and there's a commercial and you hear Swan Lake music. It's like they use a lot of the score, and yeah, that was a big part of my childhood as well.
And every generation has had, different ways in through film, right? So we heard some of the Nutcracker, right, in Fantasia, in the original Fantasia, and there have been these various access points. We haven't even talked about Black Swan. We don't have to, but it's an important adaptation. And there's the Red Shoes as well. I mean, there have been these things keep coming back through our popular culture in really interesting ways, I think. Okay, how is it that two Tchaikovsky ballets, Swan Lake and Nutcracker, are the two ballets that keep American companies in business and not those of other composers?
It's very interesting. I think Nutcracker is part of the holiday kind of canon, and then it sort of kind of goes back. It feeds on itself, right? Because Nutcracker became popular, and then so now commercialism has taken music from Nutcracker and put it in ads, and so it enters the greater like awareness of people. They go, oh, there's the Russian dance, there's the Sugar Plum Fairy dance, and then so they come to the ballet and they can hear that music and they go, oh, I know that part. And it's really great. And then I don't know, Swan Lake, we've been talking about it all night. It's just the story, and it's one of those ballets that was really worked and has became, it become this. I don't know why other ones
I have
haven't.
an idea.
Okay, go for it, B.
I think the answer isn't the question. I think it's because Tchaikovsky wrote the music.
Well, there's that. Yeah.
Every year when we get ready, when I contemplate doing yet another Nutcracker, I thank my lucky stars that it was Tchaikovsky and not Minkus. Minkus wrote music that worked very well for the purpose, but it would be hard to think about doing 34 consecutive performances of Bayadere or Corsair. That would be tough.
Right. And
Even tougher.
You have other composers, Prokofiev and things like that really, have wonderful scores, Cinderella, Romeo and Juliet, things like that. But they don't really fit they didn't work with Petipa, so that the classical, so the music isn't set up exactly like you have this patata, variation, coda. That is your classic patata setup. And because of that, Nutcracker and Swan Lake, well, not the Balanchine Nutcracker because they took the male variation out, but we have that set up in the ballets as well. So there's that.
Simon,
I've worked with Balanchine.
Yes, I know.
um,
And it was we did the ballet last year. It was Prodigal Son. Yeah.
do you have a theory about?
I just like the question because it's like American companies, and one nice thing about Nutcracker is part of it was composed in the United States. The Sugar Plum Fairy, he actually started working on that on the train up to Niagara Falls when he visited for the opening of what became Carnegie Hall. So
Having heard of the tragic news about the death of his sister,
yeah, he went. It was obviously he didn't want to make this trip all the way to the U.S., but it was lucrative, and he, from St. Petersburg, he passed through Paris and went to see what was going on in the news. So he went to a reading room, and there was newspapers, including the obituary for his sister.
Terrible.
So that actually fueled a lot of the intonations of that score, I think.
Act 2 in particular, or the whole thing, do you think?
Well, it's what throbs throughout Nutcracker is a pattern, a rhythmic pattern, which comes out of the memorial Russian Requiem, Panikhida, and there's an awful lot of music in the Ballet des Nations, the sort of the character dance, the dance is associated with sweets, etc., and goodies in the second act that are associated with his sister. So, memories of childhood with her, and the sugar factory that opened up near where she lived kind of fueled some of that.
So we've talked about, so Billy Jennifer talked about cleaning the tutus, but how are the other costumes cleaned? I'm always thinking about like the gentleman's tunics and if they were made of velvet and so on. How does one clean that?
Every garment in the ballet has a different way of being cleaned, pretty much. So there's a lot of hand washing. There's dry cleaning. We will take garments and we will open them up and we will wipe them down several times. So there's layers of cleaning sometimes, depending on how many shows we've done. But it's definitely a huge part of our process, because that guarantees that costumes will continue to be with us for generations, and making sure that we're restoring them and cleaning them simultaneously.
So we've talked about how to get costumes ready in between, say 3 years apart. But what we haven't talked about is, for instance, with Nutcracker, when we have so many performances, what happens between every performance? Sometimes we have 2 performances a day. What cleaning happens between every single performance?
That's a really good question. So I don't know if anyone is hanging out online as much as I am sometimes, but there was a video where someone did a tutorial on using vodka spray for cleaning costumes. And that was probably the most number of inbox questions I've ever received. Is that true? Do you? Yes, we use vodka spray. One of my very first purchases on the company card was 2 giant jugs of vodka, bottom shelf
Me too.
vodka.
No.
Oh yeah.
There's
That's why
vodka
I
in
looked
the
right at
wardrobe
you.
department at the theater, and it's always like, oh,
Oh, you have
what's
fun
that
in there?
for?
Party scene. So in between shows, we are really careful to make sure that costumes have time to be cleaned and dried out. So if it's a costume where it gets really heavily used, where it comes
By
back,
more than one dancer?
yes, sometimes if they have to
Not
share.
sure people know that, yeah.
Which we do have multiple. So for instance, we have 2 Odettes available. We have 2 Odiles available, but with 6 casts, that means that there's costume sharing. So we will clean them out. We will bring them and put them over a large fan and let them dry, and we will do any repairs to them. So between shows, that is a really big task. There are a number of dressers, somewhere between 10 and 12 dressers that are backstage. And each floor, those dressers are in charge of making sure that those costumes get cleaned, aired out, and ready to go for the next show.
Costumes and tights, yes?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yes, and an extensive amount of laundry and an extensive amount of laundry packing. Stay for the Swan Lake conversation. Stay for the laundry business.
We're going to just squeeze in one last question. It's for Charles. When rehearsing for Swan Lake, are there any unique challenges that arise different from rehearsing other ballets? It's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there are. Each ballet is completely different, but in what's needed for their rehearsals. I think Swan Lake is particularly challenging in a few areas. First of all, it's the sheer magnitude, length, spanning of classical technique that you have to have. Adagio, allegro, grande allegro, partnering, all those things. It's one of this. It's like it's just the most difficult ballet to do, and trying to get all of those things and all of the other aspects into the rehearsals is very difficult. And it's also very difficult. The big challenge is when you're getting near to the shows, being able to get through the entire ballet in an hour. And that is very, very difficult, because that means that there isn't a whole lot of time for particular stopping and starting and notes, and we'll take it back a few minutes and we'll continue on. And yeah, so you're really kind of going through it, and that's one of the biggest challenges to Swan Lake is getting there, getting everybody to that place and able to do it in an hour. And that is where we're sort of at right now.
That's a great way to end. I thank enormous thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their insights and expertise. Also, enormous thanks again to Judy and Alan Friedman for sponsoring this. This is our second time doing it. Last year, we had a wonderful conversation about Prodigal Son, and I hope we'll just continue in the future. If you haven't purchased your tickets yet, please do so now. And please buy Simon's wonderful book, Tchaikovsky's Empire. It's really a fantastic book. It's not intimidating for folks who don't read a lot of musicology, I don't think, and extremely informative and hugely refreshing. So thank you all so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice.
And thanks to our audience. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Great questions.